kind of skip a topic and ask you, the big issues that we've been dealing with as a country for the past couple of weeks, which is, of course, the death of George Floyd and the protests and, how that's impacted our view of one another, about law enforcement, about racism and things like that. I had a chance to attend several, protest rallies in March. My kids and I did one in Roselle from the high school where my kids went to the police station. It was a wonderful, peaceful march, and it was very motivational. But just kind of stepping back, what your thoughts are about the current situation, and are you hopeful? So what's your thought about the current situation? Are you hopeful that this will try to, increase awareness of some of these, social problems in our community? So I'll start with Jay, because I know Jay always has a lot on his mind. So.
I would say I'm simply present in the moment. America's greatest sin, original sin, is systemic racism. I was on a conference call. First of all, if you're in a white church and you're a white pastor, the best thing you can do right now is get with your pastoring colleagues of color and start to listen. So I've tried to do that as a practice. And there are real painful things that even I have not heard about, let's say, Chris Wheaton, and experiences within places we wouldn't think that they would occur. And, I think that the women's marches have paved the way for a culture of advocacy amongst the kids. And also the pandemic, Imam was saying maybe there's something good. It has made us more attuned to what's going on. We've all been in our homes, and some of us have been suffering more than others, and especially the African-American community we've known for a long time through this pandemic are suffering more than everyone else. And so all these things coming together is a real kairos moment, or a moment where perhaps we see not where God is, but where humanity is. And so I am hopeful in the continuance of the outcry and of some of the legislation that I'm seeing slowly or quickly get passed. It is amazing, the systemic nature of all this. I guess I'm looking at who's on the line here. I could just say, as a white clergy person, we really need to all work together. What I've heard continually from my African-American colleagues is we have done what we can. It's time for our white brothers and sisters to rise up. And so trying to figure out what that looks like, but I am hopeful for what I'm seeing. And, as I'm on this conference call, I'm aware of how I'm in need of colleagues to help me stay the course, because it's a course that is unknown, but that needs to be walked down. So those would be just a few thoughts, Azam, where I think it's a historic moment, that's for sure.
Yeah. Thanks, Jay. And I agree that I think there's something different about the current situation, at least that I've noticed compared to other situations. When I marched in Downers Grove last weekend, it was an unbelievable crowd. It must have been 2 miles long, because when we went around, we were towards the front of it. As we came around the block, it was still going. And the people there the participants is what surprised me the most. Mostly white, young, old, it didn't matter what your background was. It was just unbelievable. And I wanted to kind of ask, Chris, what your thoughts are as you see so many people from the broader majority community coming out with signs that say Black Lives Matter, right? Because for many years, Black Lives Matter was deemed, quote unquote, controversial, et cetera, by certain segments, political pundits and so forth. And yet you see my kids had Black Lives Matter signs. All these young kids had them. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are. Is this something that surprised you? You're hopeful, or you're like, oh, it's about time now, So I'm curious.
Well, a couple of things. Let me just say something before I get to the specific question that you just asked. And that is one of the marches that rallies, events that I went to in Wheaton. I was kind of amazed. I met with about 30 or so people from my congregation in our church parking lot with masks and social distancing. And we talked about what they might experience as we went on to line up on Roosevelt Road. But I asked them to look for signs of the presence of God during this day, and that God is with us even in the valley of the shadow of death. But I shared with them from my own personal experience that my father was a police officer in the city of Chicago for over 20 years, and my brother just retired from the Chicago Police Department after 30 years of service. My father was involved in a police shooting early in his career, but I've also had the misfortune of having the first kid who called me dad, not my own son, but the first kid who called me dad in this world, killed in an incident with the Chicago police on Memorial Day. And of course, it was Memorial Day when George Floyd lost his life as well. But as we went forward and stood on Roosevelt Road, there was a woman in a car that was driving past, going westbound on Roosevelt Road. She was 94 years old, and when I saw her in her orange shirt, there was just this palpable energy about her. And I looked at the person next to me and I said, there's something special about that woman. And she was encouraging everyone on. Turns out her name is Joyce Wagner. She's 94. She is a survivor of Auschwitz. And so seeing her and seeing the people stretch from Main Street in Wheaton all the way to Main Street in Lombard does give me hope, but only in the sense of when people say Black Lives Matter, it has to be much, much more than a slogan. Black Lives Matters has to be a political platform. It has to be something that takes flesh in policy and changes the practices. So again, getting at real structural evil, addressing this original sin that Jay talked about in our society. So it's got to be more than chanting and marching and walking. It's got to be real. It's got to be real in our daily lives and in our institutions. And we've got to do that hard work of that hard anti-racist work and take that on as a responsibility for each of us every day.
Mm-hmm. Reverend Lewis, as somebody who also has a pretty good congregation of mixed congregants, and you yourself being if I could say, a brown background, Puerto Rican background. I consider myself brown too for whatever reason. But how are you sort of absorbing this incredible change in protest generally? I think you need to unmute.
One of the things, as you mentioned, I am a native of Puerto Rico, which what I say is maybe sounds very political. I am part of an island that is still a colony of the United States. And for that, you can go from any direction you wanted to go. One of the things I learned when I begin to work with this work of dismantling white privilege and anti-racism, because I know what it means to be brown in America. I know what it is to be stopped because of the color of my skin. I know all that. And Chris and I have stories to tell about that after. But one of the things I learned in the history of this great nation is that all our institutions, including our religious institutions, has been founded in the 1700s to support slavery. And that was an amazing fact to me, because we continue building those institutions, continue guiding our principles and our life, but they have not been set free from slavery. So with that in mindset is, unless we dismantle the systematic racism in our institutions, we will not see that hope. We have been before, and I am amazed to see the tone, the participants, the racial mix. Yes, at some point it gives me hope, but unless we change the institutions, unless we get out and vote and change the things that are wrong, I don't know how long this hope can live, because the institution is the one, our system is so broken, from government, from banking, from healthcare, all is broken, and because it's based on those laws passed in 1700 to support slavery. So unless we are free from that, and even look in this case, our Christian faith, look even the United Methodist Church, who in a split over owning a slave, and then we decide to get together and decide to segregate African Americans. So it's not about confessing the sin of racism, it's to decide that it's time for us to dismantle racism from the institutions that perpetuate racism even today. Yes, it gives me hope, but it's hard work, and it has to happen now. Otherwise, it will go another moment that we miss.
Mm-hmm. Andrea, your thoughts on the situation? If you want to take a different direction, we can. I want to get your perspective.
Well, again, just as a Jewish person who has suffered persecution, we are obligated to action, that it is not okay to stand idly by while the blood of our neighbor is being shed. So we are committed to racial justice. We are committed to building a world where there is equality and dismantling, to everyone's point, the systemic racism. What encourages me right now is that my congregants who would probably never have been open to this level of dialogue that we're having now are absolutely torn apart by the recent events and are willing to have those difficult discussions about inherent white privilege, about racism that's ingrained in people that are older, that would never normally be open to these kinds of conversations, to be willing to examine how they've been raised, the biases that are inherent in our world and in our own personal biases. But it has to be deeper than a book discussion or, again, just conversations. That if we don't capitalize on this time to, as Pastor Reyes said, change the world, this is the time, and this is the generation where it really could happen. We've never seen these Confederate statues be brought down. I lived in the South for many years, and the Civil War is alive and well. There are bumper stickers that say, "Lee surrendered, I didn't." I mean, there is systemic racism built into our country's culture that if we don't start having these conversations and don't start saying, this has to change, nothing's going to change. So I would like to think that I have hope for the future. Elie Wiesel, I believe, said it best, that the opposite of hate, the opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference. And we can't stay indifferent to what's going on in our world today because the opportunity is too ripe. And we have a population of Jews of color. You know, Jews come in all different shapes, sizes, colors, backgrounds. It's not just Jews are white, middle class, they all look alike. We are all different people, and everyone must be fought for. All rights have to be on the table, especially for our community.
It's interesting you say that. There's something called the Decalogue Society, which is the Jewish Bar Association in Chicago. The current president happens to be African American. So, you know, people are, you know, I think having more awareness and becoming more tolerant and accepting of differences in many ways. Also, you mentioned about the South. You know, I went to grad school in Georgia, and you're right about the view that the Civil War isn't really over. I remember a fellow Georgian who was one of my graduate student colleagues, nice guy, we got on really well. And we were talking to our professors about what we're going to do after our master's. I was going to go to law school and he was going to do a PhD. And the professor encouraged him to go to the Northeast, to Yale, Princeton, one of these big Ivy League schools. And his response was, I'm not going to go and hang out with them Yankees. And I was like, wow. It's like, in fact, the professor said, hey, dude, the Civil War is over. Come on, you know? So, and that was just, I mean, that's 20 years ago, but that's not that far away, you know? So that those sort of attitudes, I think, persist because people don't want to challenge them. And they just kind of stay quiet for the sake of getting along and move on. And I think those attitudes really continue to persist. We do have a question that came up, which is related to something earlier, but I just want to ask it so we can get it done before we conclude. The question I'll ask you, Andrea, it says, I'm worried about the fear many children are going through. What can parents do and say to make sure that the children stay safe, but not be unduly scared? So what advice do you give to parents, both in terms of, I guess, what's going on about racism, but also, you know, this whole pandemic situation?
I think as parents, it is incumbent on us to be the lenses through which our children interpret the world. And so it's important that we we take this opportunity not to shy away from shielding our children unnecessarily, but rather to frame it so that they are empowered with the skill set and the ability to speak to whatever age they're at. Obviously, you're going to speak very differently about what happened to a 9-year-old than to a 16-year-old, but to not have those conversations about, as a parent, your worldview and how these children can have the skills to navigate the world, that pain and violence and unfairness happen, but we have an opportunity to work for justice so that people's lives are not lost in vain, that we can move forward. So I believe in teaching our children to have skills to live in the real world. We don't shield them, but we also don't have to expose them to only the underbelly of humanity without giving them, obviously, tools in which to navigate how to get along in society.
Excellent. Very good. And let's just kind of go in a roundtable and ask the same questions for all of you, because you guys deal with, giving advice and listening to members of your faith and your church. So, Jay, how about you? What would you be telling your congregants to talk to their children about in terms of the current situations that we're dealing with, both the overwhelming situation with the pandemic, but also with the racism situation and so forth?
My daughter Haley came to me 2 nights ago, just before bed, and she laid down next to me and she said, "Dad, I'm scared I'm going to die. I'm scared of death."
Wow.
And all I could say, what I did say is, "You're not alone. Like this is something we're all facing together, and you are not alone." And then as far as the future, I think what Chris has mentioned a little bit, the future is in our youth. And perhaps we're a passing generation that has got to hold, we've got to get done what we need to get done. But I have great hope in the next generation and how active they are right now. I guess I'd only speak for my teenage daughter and son, but there's a generation that's very much more activist and gets this. And I would only throw out there one more thing, Azam, is that we have got to get out to the polls. We've got to get out and vote. We've got to vote in leaders that understand this issue. We have to hold people accountable for when they are silent. And we need to have folks that have, should we say, skin in the game, even in places such as the judgeship in DuPage County, I would say. How's that?
I couldn't agree more. Thanks. Reverend Lewis, what about you in terms of advising parents and in terms of talking to their children?
Since my kids now are grown up, they are 2 of them are out of the house. I have always shared with them any instance that I experienced was a teachable moment for them. I never sheltered them outside the reality, but I always says to them, we are together as a unit. The community carry you on. Your core values carry you on. And I will always encourage parents to, based on the age in which they are living, to answer the question that the kids have. Do not avoid those questions and dilute it, just to express them, but also to make them feel safe in a way that you journey with them, that you are together, that the community is together. But also the teachable moment, that is an opportunity for us to remind them that those moments happen and this is a reality, but there is an opportunity for us to make it better. Like Jay says, there is the hope that they can do it. My 3 kids are kind of activists, and they always look to me and says, "Well, you think that we didn't listen to your sermon when you were preaching?" I was thinking that they may be doing something else. I guess that they were listening to the sermons. Now I have to worry myself about that. But it has been an amazing conversation, mostly with my son, to see where he's taking all the teaching that he have experienced and how he's channeled this energy. And he says to me, like Jay says, that this is the generation that we will do it. We will not, and I will not will use the word that he shared with me. But I think, and I that gives me hope, to be honest with you, that they are not going to remain silent, that they are not going to see the other way, that they are going to change because the system have to change.
Mhm. Great, excellent thoughts. I mean, a lot of positive feelings and ideas. Listen up, rise up, be safe. Use this as an opportunity, of course, hope. I know, I think maybe it was Andrea who earlier said, or someone said that, it's not just about reading and learning books and so forth, but I do want to make one recommendation of a book, which I think is good, that I read a couple of years ago, but I think it's really timely even now, which is the book by Ta-Nehisi Coates called Between the World and Me. And it's about, an African-American young man who is raising, a son, and what he is telling his son about the world that he grew up in and the world that he will face, his younger son. And it's a very personal account, and it's very well written. So I would highly recommend that. And Toni Morrison, by the way, says this is required reading. So if there's anything else you guys would like to add in terms of recommendations or